Questo incontro, che fa parte del ciclo di conferenze interdisciplinari sul tema identità e vocazione, in occasione del 50° anniversario della fondazione dell'Istituto di Psicologia di questa Pontificia Università Gregoriana. Così. Il tema di stasera si vede con il titolo Human Beings, Reasonable and Moral, The Civil Disobedience of Rosa Parks. Esseri umani ragionevoli e morali, la disobbedienza civile di Rosa Parks. Le due relazioni saranno in lingua inglese e alla fine, quando c'è spazio per qualche domanda o commento o suggerimento, si può parlare sia in inglese sia in italiano, perché si capirà. Okay. Allora vorrei presentare adesso i due relatori. Il primo padre Jong-Yun Hwang, della Corea, che conoscete quasi tutti, professore straordinario all'Istituto di Psicologia, dove da 10 anni si occupa, tra altro, e molto altro, della psicologia dello sviluppo morale. Padre Hwang ha studiato sia in Corea sia negli Stati Uniti d'America prima di venire a Roma. E il secondo relatore, padre James o Jim Corkery, da un'isola del nord-ovest dell'Europa che si chiama Irlanda, professore ordinario nella facoltà di teologia, sia di teologia dogmatica che di teologia fondamentale. E per più di 20 anni egli insegnava teologia a Dublino, in Irlanda, prima di venire a Roma, dove sta adesso da quasi 8 anni. E mi è venuto di aggiungere il fatto che nella sua formazione figurano anche le scienze sociali, che forse sarà evidente oggi, immagino. Non penso che sia necessario ripetere tutto questo in inglese, capirete quando parlano i relatori. Okay? E ciascun relatore avrà 30 minuti circa per presentare il suo contributo. Poi, dopo le due presentazioni, avremo di nuovo circa altra mezz'ora per domande, eccetera, se ci sono. Così vi auguro una buona serata e buon lavoro. Sì.
Buonasera a tutti. Condividerò con voi le mie idee sull'identità dell'essere umano e quella degli ex alunni dell'Istituto di Psicologia alla Pontificia Università Gregoriana. Il titolo della mia presentazione è Human Beings, Reasonable and Moral, Lessons from the Civil Disobedience of Rosa Parks for Accompaniment for the Personal Growth of Individuals. My reflection starts with a question. As a professor at the Institute of Psychology, what kind of persons do I want my students to become? I know that most alumni of the Institute work as spiritual directors, formators, counselors, and psychotherapists. It is challenging to find an umbrella term to identify them collectively due to variety of their services. If I have to do so for the facilitation of my discussion, I might call them accompanying persons for the personal growth of individuals. However, I do not choose this term to define their identity. It is mainly because I adopt the idea of Oysterman and her colleagues regarding identity formation. They suggest that identities are not the fixed markers people assume them to be, but are instead dynamically constructed in the moment. This implies that the judgment and choices of individuals formulate and reformulate their identities. Particularly, judgment regarding moral issues such as justice and equality construct the core aspects of human identities. So if I respond to my initial question, what kind of persons I want my students to become, I may answer that I wish my students to make right choices to construct the identities of human beings, reasonable and moral. Having this intention in my mind, I will discuss first the moral judgment and identity formation of individuals through a reflection on the civil disobedience of Rosa Parks. And I'll explain later the details of her civil disobedience. Here I'd like to say that I present her as an exemplary figure who constructed human identity through moral judgment. From a social domain perspective on reasoning, I'll review how she made a judgment to disobey a law and discuss how reasonable and moral she was. Secondly, I will reflect on the necessity of a commitment to justice in accompaniments and discuss the identity of accompanying persons. Here I will present a social justice perspective on counseling. Conventionally, spiritual direction, counseling, and psychotherapy are considered politically neutral or apolitical. However, personal accompaniment can never take place in a vacuum. Certainly, social, cultural, and political complications influence the mental health and human development of individuals. So I will discuss why commitment to justice is essential in accompaniments and how accompanying persons can advocate for the human dignity and rights of those whom they accompany, both inside and outside individual sessions. Rosa Parks was an African-American Christian female activist for equality and freedom. She started her life in Alabama in the United States of America in 1913. In this state, laws and conventions segregated African Americans from the rest of American society. One of the most troublesome laws was enforced on the bus. It was the main transportation for African Americans in a city like Montgomery. The most important feature of the segregation was that the seats of the bus were divided into white and colored sections. African Americans could not take seats in the white section, even when there were vacant seats in the white section. However, when there were an overflow of European American passengers from the white section, seats in the colored section had to be given up to them. For years, African Americans complained that bus segregation was unfair, and they wanted to change it. One evening in early December 1955, Rosa Parks was sitting in the front row of the colored section of a bus in Montgomery. More European passengers got on and filled up all the seats in the white section and needed more seats. The African Americans were supposed to yield their seats to European Americans, but she did not give in. Then the driver said to her, I'm going to have you arrested. You may do that, she answered. And the two white policemen came to her. She asked one of them, "Why do you all push us around?" He answered, "I don't know, but the law is the law, and you are under arrest." It was what happened in that evening. Rosa Parks decided not to obey the law. The policeman arrested her. When African Americans in Montgomery came to know her civil disobedience and arrest, they started a bus boycott. After many days of the bus boycott and lawsuits, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that bus segregation law in Montgomery was unconstitutional. Through that long and painful process of fighting for human rights, Rosa Parks became honored as the mother of the freedom movement. I believe that Rosa Parks disobeyed the segregation law on the bus according to a rational decision. Simply put, she was reasonable. In other words, her decision was neither emotionally driven nor physically conditioned. However, many depicted her action as having been prompted by her emotional impulse and physical tiredness. In a way, they created the myth of Rosa Parks. Let's look at the story of Rosa Parks in a children's book. It depicted Rosa Parks as a poor African American seamstress. One day, on her way home from work, Rosa was tired and sat down in the front of the bus. As the bus got crowded, she was asked to give up her seat to a European American man, and she refused. The bus driver told her she had to go to the back of the bus, and she still refused to move. It was a hot day. She was tired and angry, and she became very stubborn. This description of her story emphasizes her anger as an emotional reaction and her tiredness as a physical condition. As it focuses on her anger and tiredness on a hot, packed bus, it tends to hide the truth of her story, that is, an intentional disobedience of a social activist. Instead, it renders readers to imagine it as a spontaneous outburst based upon frustration and anger. In fact, Rosa Parks heard some others even saying that she did not yield the seat because of her physical tiredness, but she corrected these false assumptions of her disobedience, saying, "I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of the working day. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." She explained clearly that her civil disobedience took place not due to any physical fatigue, but due to her conscious intention to disobey the inhumane segregation law. She did it for equality and freedom. Thus, the civil disobedience of Rosa Parks reveals that humans are rational beings who can make moral judgment by reflecting on social ideals such as justice and rights. Now I want to compare the judgment of Rosa Parks with that of policemen who arrested her. When Rosa Parks asked the police officer, "Why do you all push us around?" he answered, "I don't know, but the law is the law and you are under arrest." Both of them reasoned out what they should do, but they did not share the same principle of reasoning for their decisions. For the analysis of the difference between them, social domain theory can be useful too. Here, a domain refers to a system of reasoning that consists of a unique basis for judgment and possess distinctive formal features. It's like a group of thoughts with particular contents and forms. In human reasoning, you can find these domains. I'll use two domains of social reasoning for this discussion. They are moral domain and conventional domain. First, moral domain of social reasoning is based on social ideals or moral principles such as justice, human rights, and well-being. For example, you believe that it is appropriate to acknowledge the basic rights of humans regardless of race, age, and gender. For another example, you think that it is right to protect children from any types of violence. Here you consider the well-being of human beings. When we judge according to these principles, we make moral decisions. In addition, it is important to notice that this reasoning possesses some formal features. Above all, moral judgments are applicable to all individuals. They are universal. For example, freedom of religion is not an issue for only Europeans, but also for refugees in Europe. Furthermore, moral judgments are not dependent on the laws and authorities. For example, most children judge it wrong to hit a friend, regardless of whether there is a rule about that. For another example, currently in Myanmar, many government workers do not go to their offices. They do not want to work for the military regime. Their decisions do not depend on the current regulation or authority. So moral judgments are independent from laws and authorities. Instead, the conventional domain of social reasoning consists in the set of common rules and manners that organize and facilitate the ordinary interactions of people and functions of public-private groups. For example, in Korea, people traditionally use a spoon and chopsticks for meal. So it is not appropriate there to eat rice with hands. However, in some other countries in Asia, people have rice using hands. It is perfectly all right there. So like this kind of table manners, dress codes, and cultural and religious celebrations, rules for traffic, etc., are the main contents of conventional domain. In many cases, you can find cultural differences in this domain. In terms of formal characteristics of this domain, judgment depends on the rules and policies and traditions of communities. In some cases, there are no inherent values in specific choices. For example, you drive on the right-hand side of the road in Italy. In Ireland, the country of Father Cochery and Father Healy, the land of saints and scholars, people drive on the left-hand side. Okay? You cannot say that left-hand drive is more correct or more honorable than right-hand drive. What matters is the consensus of individuals in the community. It would be chaotic if some drive on the left and others drive on the right in the same city. However, we should understand the complexity of conventions and laws. Some of them may not respect the human rights of the poor and the vulnerable. So there can be conflict between morality and convention. In the time of Jesus, regulations regarding Sabbath did not sufficiently consider the needs of the poor, the sick, or the marginalized. That's why Jesus confronted the Pharisees and the scribes on Sabbath. What he did was morally right, but it was not conventionally acceptable. This sort of conflict took place on the bus of Montgomery in 1955. Rosa made a moral decision not to follow the disrespectful law, whereas the policeman made a judgment based on conventional reasoning, saying, the law is the law. Both of them had reasons to justify their decisions, but differed in their qualities. The one was reasonable and moral, whereas the other was reasonable and conventional. These judgments construct their identities. Rosa Parks became a rational moral agent for social changes, whereas the policeman was a conventional thinker to maintain status quo. Inspired by the humanity of Rosa Parks, here I'm going to discuss the identity of current and future accompanying persons by examining the issue of a commitment to justice in the field of counseling psychology. In the field of counseling psychology and psychotherapy, remedial model and intrapsychic model are prevalent. According to the remedial model, counselors and psychotherapists work mainly to ameliorate the psychological symptoms of the clients and regard their adjustment to their environment as a goal of therapeutic accompaniment. So they may not deal with the problems of the social environment which affect the clients. In a similar vein, treatments based on the intrapsychic model seek to analyze and modify the personality structure and thinking patterns of clients. As such, most practitioners do not consider the issues of oppression or discrimination as parts of therapy. However, it is commonsensical that racism, inequality, or political oppression in the society influence the mental health of people. At this point, I'd like to share with you the speech of Martin Luther King Jr., the Nobel Peace Prize winner, which he made to American psychologists in 1967. At the end of his discourse, he invited all people to exercise a creative maladjustment. What does it mean? When injustice prevails in a society in which people are living, those with a conscience should not adapt themselves to that social system. Instead, they should stay maladjusted to the unjust society, creatively object to unfair practices, and vigorously construct a new society with justice and equality. We can think simply this way. If the society abnormal, normal persons have no choice but to be maladjusted. Here I have some questions. What if those who are maladjusted come for psychological help? Should therapists help the clients to overcome symptoms and adjust them to abnormal society? Or they empower the clients to become agents of social change? American Counseling Association began promoting social justice as one of its core professional values. So counselors are called to commit themselves to social justice as a principal way of realizing their moral responsibilities and professional duties. Let us see how they define the promotion of social justice. The promotion of equity for all people and groups for the purpose of ending oppression and injustice, affecting clients, students, counselors, families, communities, schools, workplaces, government, and other social and institutional systems. It is calling, they are called to confront the unjust, unfair, inefficient, and inadequate practices and systems of various societal units. This declaration was quite countercultural because they had not done much for social justice. According to one study in 1999, less than 1% of European American counselors and counseling students worked for the elimination of racism. Reflecting on that pattern among the practitioners, it was decided that counselors should not only seek to meet the individual needs of clients, but also commit themselves to reform social systems that constrain human development and well-being of the oppressed. Thus, counselors are challenged to determine how to balance individual counseling interventions with conscious engagement in activities for social change. Now I'd like to discuss the identity of counselors. In 2014, Retz and Pedersen introduced the counselor, advocate, and scholar model as a new identity of helping professionals. It indicates the three essential roles that counseling psychologists play in the process of healing and growth of clients. And the role of scholar was not considered new at the time because the practitioner-scientist model of psychotherapists had been present in the field of psychology since the 1949 Boulder Conference. It is important to do studies to help people with various psychological problems. Most view the role of scholar appropriate and necessary. However, the role of advocate is something new. Let's review what they intend by advocacy. Advocacy mainly consists of empowerment and social action. In practice, they might not be considered as two independent interventions, but as two poles of the continuum of advocacy. Still, it's useful to review the unique aspects of these two types. First, empowerment implies that counselors guide their clients to become advocates for themselves, inside sessions or outside sessions if needed. For example, a client suffers maltreatment in his congregation and does not know how to address this issue to his superior. In this case, the counselor may invite the client to imagine him encountering the superior and do a role play to develop his assertiveness. With this kind of intervention, accompaniments aim at empowering clients so that they may confront the issues in the community. Secondly, social action indicates the specific involvement of counselors to advocate for the rights and well-being of clients through policy changes and system reforms. They participate in various activities from legislation and to protest. For instance, mental health work professionals may create a new law to help their clients with psychological problems to find appropriate jobs. Basically, in the society of oppression and discrimination, many people cannot confront the harsh realities of a social-political system by themselves. When they come for help, counselors may cross the opposite threshold to play the role of advocate. In sum, the counselor-advocate-scholar model confirms the duty of counselor to become agent of social changes. Needless to say, this agent should be reasonable and moral. Now I'm going to share with you some thoughts to conclude my presentation. I have prepared this presentation with deep respect for Rosa Parks. What has been achieved in human history through her civil disobedience is astonishing. Still, her life seems so ordinary in that she simply followed her moral judgment without calculating advantages or disadvantages. Her plain and assuming manner of proceeding encourages me and many others to do what she did and to become who she was. On the basis of this review on her construction of identity as a rational moral being, I suggest that accompanying persons for the personal growth of individuals embrace a commitment to social justice, that is, the role of advocate. Integrating advocacy in accompaniment requires changes in education, research, and practice. For the training of future accompanying persons, educators may consider opening new courses about the social justice perspective on accompaniment and psychotherapy for the poor and the marginalized. In terms of research, it's necessary to study how socio-political problems such as racism, unemployment, cultural oppression, or power imbalance influence human well-being and mental health, and how practitioners integrate psychological analysis with social analysis. In terms of practice, there are many hurdles to overcome. Above all, many counselors, psychotherapists, and spiritual directors have not worked with people from oppressed and marginalized groups. Because of these practices have developed conventionally among middle-class people. Even though the poor and the oppressed need much personal and social assistance, they are likely to face many barriers in getting help through accompaniment. For example, most poor laborers or small business owners cannot come to the office of a counselor during the working hours in the week. It's not easy for the poor to seek this sort of help. From the part of accompanying persons, there are also many obstacles to reach the oppressed. They tend to have limited time. They may face financial difficulties. So it is not easy to find solutions to problems related to promotion of justice in accompaniment. Still, this calling to work with the poor is so precious and cannot be ignored. In the end, I would like to make simple remarks. We accompanying persons for personal growth should acknowledge that we have often dealt with psychological and spiritual issues of people without confronting social, cultural, political hindrance to their well-being and flourishing. Upon this acknowledgement, I wish that we are not forgetful Catholic social teachings on the preferential option for the poor. In other words, I wish that we are tired of being detached from the poor. Furthermore, I hope that we became genuine advocates by transcending the conventional barriers of our practices, advocating for the dignity and rights of the oppressed, and helping others construct the identities of human beings reasonable and moral. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Father Huang. And without further ado, I'll ask Father Jim Corkery to take the podium and give us his presentation.
Quando tu sei vecchio, sono cose addizionali che devono essere portate meglio così. Buonasera a tutti, grazie della vostra presenza, grazie anche Padre Healy per l'introduzione e Padre Huang per la presentazione. Io parlerò in inglese, sto parlando inglese 67 anni, sto parlando italiano nel mio modo 7 anni, quindi preferisco parlare inglese. I'm a bit of a technophobe. Anyway, there's a small PowerPoint, but the way I have arranged the slides is not quite so sophisticated. When I push, there are 8 slides, and a few points will come up under each heading, but I don't reveal them piece by piece in the sophisticated way that you have done. But the points under each heading will tell you more or less where I'm going, and I hope they're helpful. My title is different, as you can see. Xavier and I talked when we were preparing, and I wanted my title. Initially, I took the same title as he, but he said, no, you can take one that more reflects the theological perspective. So in the end, I came up with this: Human Beings, Mysterious and Unpredictable. Theology emphasizes that. And I wanted to speak a bit about Rosa Parks' creativity. But first of all, non fa niente. Quello fa qualcosa. They said the dinosaurs were wiped out. I don't think so. We still exist. I welcome this opportunity here this evening, invited by my colleagues at the Institute of Psychology to celebrate with them and to speak with Father Xavier Huang on the 50th anniversary of your long and interesting journey at the university. I particularly like being here to reflect with you on what you have placed at the heart of your concerns over 50 years, a holistic, interdisciplinary approach to human identity and vocation that avails of psychological, spiritual, social, and theological insights and perspectives. It's an honor for me to talk to you in this tradition. Since I'm a theologian and Father Huang is a psychologist, the two perspectives tonight that will be to the fore are those of psychology and theology. And what I hope to do, not what some Jesuits do when they speak together in a public forum, I hope to complement, not to be controversial about, his presentation. I have been enriched by what he said and wrote, and I will try to complement that. Human beings, reasonable and moral, these words from the title find an easy home within theology as well as within psychology. Theologians based on Genesis 1, 26 to 27, speak of human beings as created in the image of God. A foundation is laid in saying that for speaking of the human as reasonable and free. And we catch an interesting glimpse of this in the story of the conversion of Father Avery Dulles, the young student Avery Dulles, by the river in Boston one February afternoon. When he saw, his eyes were opened, his atheism and materialism being shattered before his eyes were opened, I quote, to see the processes of reason and will guiding the budding forth of a young tree on that early spring day, whose little buds in their innocence and meekness were following a rule of which I, said Dulles, had yet known nothing. And wondering how this could be, he continued. He pointed out that its actions were ordered to an end by the only power capable of adapting means to ends, namely intelligence, and that the very fact that this intelligence worked towards an end also implied purposiveness. In other words, implied a will. It was useless, then, he said, to dismiss these phenomena by obscurantist talk about a mysterious force called nature. The nature which was responsible for these events was distinguished by the possession of intellect and will. And intellect plus will, he said, makes personality. So what Dulles intuited on that February afternoon wandering by the river was the divine personality, the characteristics of which he named as intellect and will. When you remember the text then of Genesis that I quoted, it makes sense from a theological as well as from a psychological point of view to speak of the human as reasonable, based on intellect, and moral, based on will and freedom. And so the theologian and the psychologist can be in harmony today. In other words, reason and faith. I'll take psychology to be the representative of reason and theology to be the representative of faith, even though both could be on the other side too. Now, from reason, taking psychology as its mouthpiece, we have learned what it means in a human life to live reasonably and morally. It means, as the life of Rosa Parks shows us, to reflect on and to arrive at one's decisions by being attuned to key social values: justice, the human flourishing of all, equality for all, and the protection of basic human rights. In a person's journey to forming their mature identity in the human community, these, as we saw, are the values that guide their reasoning and inform their choices. From faith, taking theology as its mouthpiece here this evening, I see an understanding of the human compatible with psychology, as just described, because Christian theological anthropology does not understand human freedom as free-floating, as without norms or signposts to guide it. Rather, Christian anthropology sees the exercise of freedom as being normed by what it understands human beings to be, created freely by God in love, and above all, for relationships. And this being created to flourish in relationships with God, with others, and with the earth, and not in isolation, is in fact what directs human reason and human freedom on their journey to the making of reasonable and moral choices, choices that will shape people's identity over the years. So both on the theological side and on the psychological side, we can speak of a freedom that is normed, and theology sees that freedom as normed by what it is God created us to be, above all, beings of love. It has changed its directionality for some reason. Having said that about the compatibility of our two disciplines, I want, because that's what I get paid for, to say something about the distinctive theological perspective. Drawing from the so-called full hand of faith, the various doctrines of theology, but particularly from Christian anthropology, it seems that a central point is that God is mystery, incomprehensible, never fully fathomable. And human beings reflect this characteristic also. In fact, the characteristic points to human irreducibility and unrepeatability. The Swiss theologian in 1974, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, he was querying one day, why am I precisely I? I am I, he responded, because from all eternity, God intended, wanted, loved, and chose me. The element of irreducibility is clearly visible here, because there is nothing to which the human can be ultimately reduced. Not biology, not psychology, not sociology. The great strength of these particular sciences is the depths to which they can go to shed light on key dimensions of the human. And in doing this, they open a window for us also on the depths of the human mystery of humanity. But this is especially theology's task. Theology's responsibility is to keep the mystery of the human ever in view amid all explanation, ensuring that our human incomprehensibility mirrors that of the divine. If God is mystery and we image God, then we are mystery also. Think of any deep relationship you have, and you know that this is true. The more you get to know the other person, the more you get to know that you don't know the other person. The great 20th century German theologian Karl Rahner is very keen to understand this, to emphasize this matter of mystery and incomprehensibility. And he emphasizes what he calls radicalization, Radikalisierung in German, where the theological dimension of the human person is concerned. he says that at root, that is radically, the human being is always exposed to or standing before God's fundamental offer of relationship. We call it grace, of relationship with God that is offered to the freedom of every human creature. It is an offer that envelopes, that's bad English, envelops, but I want you to think of an envelope surrounding human existence from the moment that it comes into being. It is enveloped by this invitation by God to relationship and closeness. And it is before that that the human stands in his or her mysterious totality. In fact, Ranner points out that if you enter reflection on the human by any of the regional or particular anthropologies and push them to their roots, Radikalisierung, you end up in the same place, touching this most mysterious dimension. And it is right here that who the human being actually is will find its deepest expression, while at the same time, if somewhat paradoxically, retaining its ultimate inexpressibility. Central, never able to be omitted, is for Ranner the human being's meeting with the mystery of the divine. Now you might say, why all that? Why didn't I stay with the compatibility that I discovered between the two positions of Father Huang and myself, rather than bringing forward this incomprehensibility? Psychology 2 points to it in certain ways. I bring it forward because, well, for example, taking the action of Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her seat on that bus on the 1st of December 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. Ultimately, while it's an action we can see coming about through the life that preceded it, we also know that we cannot fully explain it. It was interesting how Father Wang pointed out that this guy Cole explains it a certain way. Rosa explains it much more accurately, but even she would acknowledge the element of mystery too. The action depended not only on how she had lived her life prior to that moment, and not only on her convictions, biblically based, she was always a churchgoer, about the equal dignity of all, her convictions based on what her mother and grandfather had taught her. But besides all that, influencing it too was this mysterious reality called grace, that silent offer of which to human existence God always makes his overture. And so my complementary title with Father Huang's this evening is Human Beings, Mysterious and Unpredictable, the Creative Task of Act of Rosa Parks. I did it right this time. What I want to underline is this. While much of the life of Rosa Parks, as she discloses it in the book Rosa Parks, My Story, does not seem especially mysterious or even unpredictable, as she narrates it in her very matter-of-fact way, nevertheless, the mysterious workings of what theology calls grace are ever present. I know her refusal to give up her seat on that bus did not fall from the sky. It was prepared for her by her existence prior to that day. When people said afterwards that she had done it because she was tired, she said, as you heard, no, the only tired I was tired of giving in. Their explanation was pedestrian and monochrome, not hearing what she was really saying at 42, following a previous lifetime of always having to give in to what she knew was injustice and discrimination, because she had, for as long as she could remember, a sense of the equal dignity of every person. So her act on the bus was the fruit of a life lived and seen in a certain way, a life that I believe may be called a converted life. What is that? From psychology, we have seen that it is a life lived according to reason, tethered to the social values of human rights, equality for all, and justice. And from theology, we have seen, or we are beginning to see, that a converted life is one that is lived in continual positive response to the offer of grace surrounding or enveloping human existence and beckoning, calling a person towards the infinite horizon of truth and goodness that gravitationally attracts, in mysterious yet audible silence, their desires and actions from the very beginning of their life. The person who lives in dialogue with and in response to this ultimate mystery, that grounds his or her very being, influencing it at every moment, this person is living a converted life. That idea comes from Bernard Lonergan and Sebastian Moore. This life is a gift of grace, and no less such a gift while being simultaneously a creative existence in human freedom given by God and truly a gift of created humanity. From the points of view of theology and psychology, we cannot now talk about a dance, a cooperation. Not freedom, no grace. Not grace, no freedom, but freedom and grace. In a way, that's all I want to say tonight, that there is always something more than you can see. I'm Irish. Father Healy will tell you the sky changes every 15 minutes in Ireland. The light changes, there are shadows, there are mysterious kinds of happenings in nature which make you always be attuned to more than you can see. As I said once before, as an Irish person, I find it easier to believe in things I can't see than in things I can. The grace of which I speak is not something that can be seen, but it is the theologian's job to be a detective of that grace. You find it speckling the spirituality of St. Ignatius of Loyola, finding God in all things. Ignatius didn't make a great contribution to theology. He wasn't one of the big ones like Ranner and Lonergan. But what he did contribute was the notion of God working in the world. God is active. Like Isaiah says, 43:19, "Behold, I am doing a new thing." And theology's job is to detect that. Sometimes it happens in human life that circumstances come to a head, to a kind of nodal point, to a moment calling for creative and as yet unimagined response. And that happened in the life of Rosa Parks, and that happened also in a more dramatic and more turning around kind of way in the life of Avery Dulles. Dulles speaking about how in the darkness of his inner world, he was living from a godless philosophy, his highest human instincts were confronted with a vacuum, and of that he said, "Into that vacuum stepped the grace of God." The barren desolation of my materialist philosophy, its utter falseness, and my humiliation at discovering it to be so, gave God his chance. And into that vacuum stepped grace. There are times, and you know them too, in the lives of men and women, when God's mysterious, active presence, making loving, encouraging overtures to our freedom, in concrete situatedness, acquires a special palpability and touchability. I speak of touch times, different for Dulles than for Parks, and there are others too. Not everybody has a conversion of the before and after kind. If I had more time, I would talk about all of the Catholic theological thinkers whose life went in continuity. Thomas Aquinas never had such a conversion, nor did Karl Ranner, nor did Elizabeth Johnson. We know of their childhood being brought up and nourished in faith, and then they're coming to a point of appreciation of that faith that made them want to think about it. But there was no break or rupture or conversio, and nonetheless it was a converted life. There is a nice story about Edward Skilabex. He was one of 14 children, the Dominican from Flanders, and when he was a baby, quite small, his older brother brought him to the crib at Christmas in the church. And he said, "Eddie," in a very authoritative voice, "that baby is God." And Skilabex said, well, I heard that, and I spent the rest of my life, trying to figure out what it meant. I have jumped a bit because I know time will run out. I would class Rosa Parks among the people who didn't have the dramatic type of reversal conversion. But I would say she lived a converted life, in dialogue with the ground of her being, informing her of the truth about humanity. And one truth she saw straight off was that racism was not in correspondence with God's dream for humanity. Why did she see that? Because she was correctly located. Rosa Parks received the grace that you get from being located on the underside of history. Not on the top, where the privilege to see things a certain way, and not only see them a certain way, I think I can move on the slide, and not only see them a certain way, but also believe the rationalizations that society produces for saying to you, things must be this way. The bus driver questioned nothing. But if you spent all your life living on the underside, you might have questioned more. I'm drawing on some things that come from theology here as well, and particularly from some of the theologies of liberation, not just those from Latin America, but you would say also feminist theology, theology on behalf of other races, people of other religions, other gender orientation. These theologies are called advocacy stance theologies, and they all say that you should begin theology with a foot trip. I rest this particularly on Gustavo Gutierrez, the Peruvian, who is still alive. He's about the same age as Joseph Ratzinger. They were born 1 year apart. He says theology begins with the foot trip, not with the head trip. Because it's only when you relocate to that part of society which enables you to see things from the point of view of people who are victims of injustices and exclusion, that you will be able to read the gospel with the lens through which the gospel focuses itself. The preferential option for the excluded. The picture might be Jesus calling blind Bartimaeus in from the margins while the people tried to put him in his place. She, therefore, found herself on the side of a history that didn't exclude systematically any particular people. The accounts of people who write those limited histories, and there are more of them in the libraries than there are histories written from the perspective of people on the underside, these are always truncated accounts of humanity. They don't represent God's dream for human life. They fall short of what Christian anthropology teaches about the equality and lovability and beauty of all. They're distorted and truncated. In social or collective terms, they represent visions of reality that we normally refer to as isms. Racism is one. But if you look through society, you see the various isms, and an interesting analysis was done by a theologian whose name I don't mention. His name is Ormerod, he's an Australian, but he points out that the isms in a society, the truncated viewpoints that keep some people on top and others below, and generate social structures and social behaviors to support this, that these isms are really rationalizations at a social level. People are able to argue quite well why this must be so. But of course, the fundamental presuppositions are wrong. Upside people are always convinced of these rationalizations. Downside people are not. And that is why upside people require a conversion that is fairly radical if they are come to see and to come to act in accordance with grace conceived of socially. I jumped a bit there just to get to this more or less last section. Being Irish, I remember the 19th century, not that I'm that old. But in the 19th century, we had a famine. And for 3 years in a row, there weren't enough potatoes. But potatoes were the staple diet of Irish people. You will never go to an Irish house, even today. My mother always cooked more potatoes than were needed. She always said defensively, you never know who might drop in. So we are always afraid of running out of potatoes. Therefore, I always have too much in the limited time I am given for my talk. But let me just go on to this last point. You're probably used to thinking of freedom and grace in individual terms. We live our lives trying to respond to the call of God as individuals. We confess, we repent, we do all those things that can easily be understood on an individual level. But theologians reflecting on grace, above all in contexts of social evil, of isms, and of oppressions, they have recognized that certain attributes of grace, God's concrete mediated presence with and in humanity, that certain attributes tend to be to the fore when God's help is needed in socially oppressive situations. Individual solutions are not effective for collective problems. Did you hear anybody else more or less say that this evening? When Father Huang pointed out, I was very grateful for this, that it's not enough for a therapist to help a person to adjust to society, especially when society is unjust. There must be also adjustment of society in order for that person to grow in those social circumstances. If St. Paul is correct when he said in Romans 5:20, where sin abounded, grace abounded more, then might that not be true also when a social sin is present? So then you would expect a reality such as social grace, that is, grace conceived with social dimensions. And you would expect, indeed, that such graces might be granted in situations where just injustice is experienced. Will it still involve individuals and their free moral choices? Of course. But it will take people to new places also, to places where coming together they will have an effect on the evil social reality that they could not simply have by acting as individuals alone. Theologians have pointed to some key moments in the process of grace socially conceived, and three of these are the moment of awareness, the moment of resistance, and the moment of action together. The journey of Rosa Parks, you can see already why I'm bringing these up, because it sheds light on the presence in her life with others of these three moments. First, the grace of awareness. Am I doing okay for time? Okay. I won't, like every priest says, I won't keep you long, but I won't keep you long more. Rosa Parks was aware. She was aware from what she saw as a child. Like the king in Hamlet, my offense is rank, it smells to heaven. She knew their offense was rank and smelled to heaven. And David, after he talked to the prophet Nathan, knew that he was the man. But she also knew this in a social sense, that they were the men. She recognized at a group level that the offense in society was rank and it smelled to heaven. She saw this already from the social circumstances in which she grew up. Her family, Miss White's school, paradoxically so named. Miss White was the teacher who ran the school that taught all the African American children of their dignity and worth. And the third was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. All of them were communities of grace, also grace socially operative, helping those in this particular class to see their worth as dignified and free. From collective awareness, another step was taken that theologians of grace socially conceived often identify as resistance, and Rosa resisted. She stood up for herself in the face of unfair and unequal treatment, even as a child, telling numerous instances of this in her book. Once she met, at the age of 19, and married Raymond Park, the first activist Parks that she had ever known, she received encouragement not only to continue resisting, and she went well beyond resisting on behalf of herself, to activism and resisting on behalf of others. Between resistance and acting together with others for social change, the journey is very short. During the 12 years that Rosa Parks spent as secretary of the Montgomery branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, before her fateful action on December 1st, 1955, she had been drawn ever more not only to resistance, but increasingly also to activism. Thus, what she did on the 1st of December 1955, while an act of her own, spilled over into a collective action, the full proportions of which neither she nor anyone could have possibly imagined. Because as she later realized, and I quote her, "This incident was what brought the masses of people together to stay off the buses in Montgomery." And thus was the civil rights movement born. No one can identify precisely either the nature or distinctive features of all the operations of grace involved in that individual and then collective action, but there is no doubt that the mysterious finger of God was present. And hidden and active there, in tandem with the growth in awareness, resistance, and shared action on the part of all those people who took part for 380 days to their enormous inconvenience in the bus boycott in Montgomery. Where sin abounded, where social sin abounded, social grace indeed abounded too, building in a love mysterious and freely given on the free creative act of Rosa Parks's civil disobedience in early December 1955. She was, like Jesus, the one for the many. We say in the liturgy, for you and for all. After his pattern, she became the one for the many, and when people joined her and walked with her, they became what Christians are meant to be today, the few for the many. Joseph Ratzinger says that God, who alone saves, never saves alone. He wants us, in fact, to be the few for the many unsaved, and envisages salvation as a process of human involvement with God for the betterment of others. We see something of that illustrated on the life of this simple yet highly complex person. Thank you, and apologies for giving you too many potatoes.